Liu Zongyuan, climbing the gate tower at Liuzhou, sent to the governors of Zhang, Ding, Feng, and Liang prefectures. From this high tower, a view of wilderness, a huge expanse of gloom between sea and sky. A sudden wind gust agitates the lotus in the moat. Heavy, slanting rain invades the fig trees on the wall. There are mountains choked in woods to the far horizon. The river makes 9 curves like twisted bowels. Stranded in the southern land of tattooed folk, there's precious little likelihood of news from home. So, this is the 4th out of 5th poems in this collection by Liu Zongyuan, or Liu Zongyuan. And we've talked about him before when we talked about those previous 3 poems. He is a very important mid-Tang writer, not so much famous as a poet. He is very famous as a prose writer. In fact, he, along with Han Yu, is the couple of Tang writers that are included among the top Chinese prose writers of the Tang and Song dynasties and are frequently collected in anthologies. He was a sponsor and a practitioner of the Guwen movement, of the reformed prose that tried to imitate the simplicity and purity of the ancient prose of the time of the Warring States and the Zhou dynasty. So Liu Zongyuan, as I said, is not particularly recognized as a poet, but he is quite good as a poet. And his most famous poem, in fact, River Snow, is the last one, the one that hasn't been read yet, but is included in this anthology as well. So Liu Zongyuan, very quick review, recap on his life. As I said, mid-Tang poet. He was a member of a faction, of a court faction, the Wang Shuwen group. And when Wang Shuwen rose to power during the very brief reign of Emperor Shunzong in 805, this Wang Shuwen placed his followers in important positions in the government. And among those followers was Liu Zongyuan and another poet whom I also like a lot and who has a poem just next to this one in the anthology, Liuzhou. But after that year, and after having created great animosity among certain groups, especially the eunuchs, at the abdication of Emperor Shunzong, his successor Xianzong very quickly banished the members of this faction and ordered Wang Shuwen to commit suicide. So Liu Zongyuan spent most of his, in spite of being a very promising young lad who had passed the examinations very early and who was very good at literary composition, Liu Zongyuan was exiled, first to a place in the south, later on to an even more remote place in the south. And that place, which is where he ended up dying, is the place from which he's writing this poem, Liuzhou. Now, Liuzhou is in the current province of Guangxi, which is still pretty much the frontier of Chinese civilization in the extreme southwest, not far from Vietnam and not far from Canton, or Chinese Guangzhou. Now, in the Tang dynasty, this area was even more than today an extreme backwater territory. I mean, you couldn't send a person to a further away place in exile. The worst thing you could do, worse than sending someone to Liuzhou, was executing them. Or perhaps Hainan Island, which was just a little bit further on. This was an area of a semi-tropical climate, constant rain, many dangerous animals, and a very, very, very scarce Chinese population. And this is reflected in the poem. One of the complaints of Liu Zongyuan's poetic voice in this poem is that he is living in an exotic land amidst barbarians and amidst weird plants, even if they have some beauty. Not many extreme southerners rose to important positions during the Tang. I can only think of one, which we've already encountered. Zhang Zhuling, the great poet and chancellor of Emperor Xuanzong, was from the south, was from this region of the south. In fact, the south had changed. In previous dynasties, the south was the area of Chu, but at the Tang of the Tang dynasty, the middle course of the Yangtze Valley was fully Sinicized. So the stereotypes and prejudices and views about the South had been moved on to this territory, to places like Liuzhou County. Okay, so having given this introduction, so here Liu Zongyuan is climbing a tower in Liuzhou, probably one of the city gate towers, and you know this puts this poem firmly in line with the many poems of the subgenre of climbing a tower and getting inside. There's a landscapey element in the description of the peculiar subtropical or semi-tropical vegetation and sites of this area of the empire. But the strongest sub current of the poem or subtopic would be complaint. He is complaining at being in exile and far away. He is writing this poem about his unhappiness to other local governors, the governors of Zhang, Ding, Feng, and Lian, that, from what I read, were also people, scholar officials who had been part of the Wang Shuan clique and who had been sent in exile into these remote areas. Okay, so I think that's enough for the background of this poem, and let's take a look at it, as usual, couplet by couplet. Couplet 1. From this high tower, a view of wilderness, a huge expanse of gloom between sea and sky. So the initial couplet, as usual, locates us. We already know from the title that we are in Liuzhou and we're climbing a tower. The poem begins, you could say, in media res, with the poet having climbed the tower and looking out. What does he see? That's what the first couplet tells us. And the view is certainly depressing, so it already introduces us the topic that, this is not going to be a poem about lovely sights seen in a tower and an intellectual insight achieved. No, this is a dark poem, and the views are also dark, and the climate is not the Chinese heartland's climate, and probably despised by the poetic persona. So what do we see? A view of wilderness from the tower. This is a not too populated province in a remote frontier area, so what would be seen from this tower would mostly be just pure nature, hardly colonized territory, not a place of towns and villages and prosperous cities. No, this is a wilderness. It looks hardly inhabited. And not only is it a wilderness with seemingly no human presence, it's also gloomy and dark. This is the climate in the southwest is a subtropical one, high temperature all year round, high humidity and rains all year round. And we can imagine that it is raining at the time of composing this poem. So we have the grey skies and the water forming a dense, dark, greyish, depressing curtain that hides what little of the landscape might be seen. Between sea and sky, so it's all an indistinct grey, watery realm from the sea that is not too far from Liuzhou, but still relatively far, to the heavens, to everywhere. Second couplet. A sudden wind gust agitates the lotus in the moat. Heavy, slanting rain invades the fig trees on the wall. So in the second couplet we get, so the first couplet was very generic about this greyish gloom that surrounds everything. The second couplet makes it more specific in two ways. First, it indicates the natural phenomena that are creating this greyish colour. There's sudden strong winds and heavy slanting rain. But on the other half, it also gives us specific details of things, basically plants, that are growing, that are surrounding the tower that Liu Zongyuan has just climbed. And those plants that are mentioned are specific southern vegetation that would grow in the south, and that would indicate that this is an extreme southern poem in its setting. So the wind agitates the lotus in the moat. In the original, there's two different characters for lotuses, so I imagine two different varieties, which are in a moat at the foot of the tower, perhaps surrounding the city wall. And the rain invades the fig trees on the wall. In the original, the reference, so fig trees don't sound too tropical to our Western imagination. They grow in the Mediterranean area. And in the original, the reference is to a specific type of creeping fig, which is only typical of the extreme south area of China, and also to the lychee tree. So lychees and creeping figs are the ones that are on the wall and that are being invaded by water. And they would have transmitted this sense of exoticity and of southernness, not only to us, but to any Chinese contemporary of Liuzhou, especially one that dwelt in the capitals and in the north part of the country. There are mountains choked in woods to the far horizon. The river makes 9 curves like twisted vowels. So the third couplet again continues with the descriptive element. It moves us out now, not from the tower and the immediate surroundings. It's not as abstract as the first couplet. It's not so close and specific as the second couplet. It basically gives us the natural background of mountains and rivers, which are synonymous with landscape. In Chinese, mountains and rivers means natural landscape. So it gives us the specifics of that natural landscape that has only been hinted at as a wilderness. So what can we see? So the mountains are choked in woods to the far horizon. So this is a subtropical area where vegetation, like in the tropical jungles of the Amazon, and in other areas, grow very thickly. So there are no bare mountains here, as there might be in the north, which, for climatic reasons and for human reasons, exploitation of wood and resources, it did include bare mountains, but not here. Here, the trees are so dense, the vegetation is so thick, it seems to choke the mountains and make them invisible under its tapestry of intense shiny green. And the river, there's a big river. In fact, the name of Liuzhou, that province, is based on the river Li, which crossed it, which was one of the affluents of the great southern river of China, which is the Pearl River, which is the great river in the south, beyond the Yangtze, in the area of what today is Guizhou and Guangzhou. So the river makes 9 curves. It's a curvy river, and like twisted vowels. This like twisted vowels could be interpreted in different ways. Remember, Chinese is very unspecific. So there's the image of the river, like twisted vowels, but another translator that I've consulted, translates these twisted vowels as the twisted vowels of the poetic persona and his friends who are receiving the poem, like saying, I'm looking at the river and, my vowels twist, because they're in exile and they're lamenting this. And, there can be a juxtaposition of both images, probably. The twisting vowel-like aspect of the river and the vowel-wrenching frustration and sadness of Liu Zongyuan and the other governors at being sent in exile into this southwestern wilderness. The last couplet finally hammers in this idea of living among barbarians, being far from home. So the sub-theme of traveler, in this case not traveler, it's exiled, scholar official, far from home and from his or her roots. Stranded in the southern land of tattooed folk, there's precious little likelihood of news from home. We're stranded here, we're isolated in the remote south. We live among barbarians, so a very traditional convention on the Chinese literary texts about the southern peoples of China. This is already present in the Grand Scribe's records during the Western Han Dynasty. Is the idea that the ethnic groups of the south of China, most of them belonging to the Austronesic ethnic branch or to the Vietnamese ethnic branch. In fact, probably Vietnamese peoples lived in the south of China before the empire started pushing them out and pushing them down and assimilating them. So one of the customs of these Jue, of these southern peoples, it seems, was tattooing themselves. And this was pretty distinctive for the heartland Chinese, because tattooing was a penal punishment. So before the worst punishments, which were death, in the next level you would have castration, amputation of hands or feet. The next worst, so we're going from worst to better, the next one would be tattooing, which would leave an indelible mark of shame in your body. So the custom of the Southerners to tattoo themselves would, clearly put them beyond the pale of Chinese culture and civilization, and, act as, the tattooed people would act as an adequate symbol and summary of Southern barbarity. So we're here, surrounded by these tattooed barbarians. The hope of getting news from home or a reprieve from the imperial capitals is very slim. And with this depressing, sad note, finishes the poem. Liu Zongyuan never managed to return home. He died in Liuzhou. He wrote many texts there, and some of them appreciating the exotic but in many aspects lovely views and landscape of the south. So, sad melancholy poem, but there's beauty in the sadness as usual.